welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode will be an interview about excavated philosophical texts with Franklin Perkins, who is professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. You've been working on some of these newly discovered texts, these newly excavated texts, which is very exciting work. And I'm going to start by asking you an obvious question, which is to get you to tell us what sorts of texts have been discovered and where and when the discoveries were made.
Yeah, so they've found really an immense number of excavated texts recently, and there's new finds coming up all the time. So there's a lot of them from all different times. For philosophy, there's three main collections. So two of them are from the Warring States period, which would be kind of the period of classical Chinese philosophy. So they think around 300 BC. So one of those is known as the Guodian find. And that was found in 1993. And it's about 16 short texts, depending on how you break them up. So that's probably the most important of the philosophical texts. The other one is known as the Shanghai Museum Collection. And unfortunately, as the name of them suggests, these were looted texts. So we don't know where they came from. They were purchased in Hong Kong by the Shanghai Museum. They were purchased a year after the Guodian texts, and there's some overlap. There's a couple of texts in common between them, and the style's quite similar. And so pretty much everybody thinks they came from roughly the same time and place. So also around 300 BC, the Guodian texts were buried in what was then the state of Chu, which would have been at that time like the southern fringe of China, but is now more like kind of in the middle of China. So they were found in Hubei province. So those are the two main collections of texts. The other most important one is known as Ma Wangdui, and that's from the Han Dynasty. So that was buried in, I think they say around 168 BC. It was discovered in 1973. And that has philosophical texts, including a couple of copies of the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching. It has some Confucian texts. It has an interesting collection of Han Dynasty Taoist texts, usually referred to as Huang Lao texts. And it also has some interesting medical texts. So for philosophy, those are the three collections most people work on. And for me, because I work more on the classical period, I've done more with the Guodian texts and the Shanghai Museum texts. But there's lots of other ones. So there's collections of divination statements, also from like 300 BC, that at least give us some, kind of background knowledge. There's a big collection that was purchased by Tsinghua University that has more like kind of historical narratives in it. There's some Qin Dynasty, like legal cases. There's all kinds of stuff that they've been finding.
Is there some reason that they all come from such a kind of narrow stratum of the historical record? Like, why are they all from right around 300 BCE?
Those are the earliest ones that we have. And I'm not quite sure. I think it was maybe partly the conditions, like the physical conditions where they were buried that made them more likely to be preserved. But it might just be partly chance of where they've come across these tombs. There are later ones. So the earliest ones are around 300 BC, but then you pretty much have continually ones that they found from then on.
Oh, I see. So you're just telling us about the earliest texts. And of course, those are important because they often give us texts that didn't exist or weren't extant otherwise, or maybe versions of texts that weren't otherwise extant.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And they're important for philosophy because they're coming really, say, between Confucius and Mencius, who would be two of the main Confucian philosophers. So it's kind of filling in that gap between them.
You just said something about the physical circumstances under which these texts were deposited. And in the last episode, we also talked about the physical nature of the texts themselves. So we've got bamboo strips tied together with string, something like that. Can you maybe say something more, though, about what they were like? Like, what do the texts actually physically look like? What do they consist of?
The texts are written from top to bottom, right? And so each line of text would be written on one bamboo strip. And then, like you said, they'd be tied together so you could roll them up and unroll them. They couldn't be too long. So none of the texts are very long because it would get too unwieldy as a big thing of bamboo. So when they started writing later on silk, you could have longer, more material on one roll of silk. But these bamboo texts, they're somewhat limited in size. The strips are different lengths. Some people theorize that the shorter ones are maybe more prestigious texts or not, but it's not so clear what that is. In terms of like the conditions of them, one of the big problems is that the strings that tied them together all decayed. So when they're finding them, it's just a big pile of single lines of text. And so one of the big questions is then what order should you put them in? And you can kind of group them into by their size, by where the strings, you can usually see where the strings were on the strips. But that still leaves questions of like what order should they be in, with some, with like the ones that are looted, especially there's questions of whether strips might be missing, things like that.
Yeah. So it's sort of like a jigsaw puzzle trying to put it all back together.
Yeah. Yeah. And so usually it's obvious which one flows into the next, but there's lots of ones where there's key debates depending on what the proper order of the strip should be.
And is the actual writing on the strip still usually fairly legible, or is there lots of, at least in classical philosophy and classical text, we talk about lacunae, right? So gaps in the text.
Yeah.
I suppose the same thing happens here, right?
Yeah. So mostly they're fairly clear what is said on the strip, but one thing that tended to happen was where the string was a little weaker. And so a lot of the strips, like the last 3 or 4 characters will be broken off. And sometimes like a series of lines, the last 3 or 4 characters will be broken off. So there's lots of gaps like that you have to kind of guess to fill in.
This sounds formidably challenging. And one question that might leap to mind is, why would anyone bother trying to read these texts when we have perfectly readable texts that have been preserved right down through the ages? And one hint at an answer is something you already mentioned, which is that they sometimes fill in the gaps in our historical record. So we might have texts that were lost completely, and we might have versions of texts that we did have, but now we're getting a different recension or a different version of the text. Can you say something general about what the excavated texts have done to fill out our understanding of Warring States' philosophical work?
It is mostly in giving us a clearer sense of the context in which the main texts that we focus on were written, like who they're responding to. So at a very general level, probably the most significant thing is that we've tended to tell the history of Chinese philosophy as primarily debates between different schools. So the Mohists are criticizing Confucius, and then Mengzi Mencius is criticizing the Mohists, and the Taoists are criticizing the Confucians or the Mohists. That fits the rhetoric of the texts themselves. But what we see in these excavated texts is that the specifics that these philosophers are developing their positions around are primarily driven by debates within the schools. So we see much more diversity, say, within Confucian views. And if we look like what exactly is Mencius arguing, it's really being determined by what these other Confucians were saying. So overall, he's still trying to oppose the Mohists, but like the actual contours of what he's saying is really being determined by these other schools, right? And so this debate within the schools gets highlighted much more. Also with the Laozi, that seemed to come from nowhere historically, it seems so different from the Confucian text, but we found now 3 other cosmogony texts. And it's clear that what the Laozi is saying is being directed largely in response to those texts, and not just broadly to Confucianism or something like that. So it gives us a very different picture about how the debates were working at that time.
Would it be fair then to say that what happened is that the schools kind of individually hardened around a certain set of doctrines that became normative for each so-called school? So you have like a sort of Taoist position and a Confucian position and a Mohist position, but that those were themselves the result of a longer period of internal debate. And it was only once the school orthodoxy hardened that it started to become more interesting to argue across the boundaries between schools? Or is that too simplistic?
I think the general sense that people have now, partly from these texts, is that the schools were always quite diverse. So at various points in history, you have an attempt to consolidate, like this is the orthodox Confucianism. But that still changes over time. And so that really these were always being driven largely by internal debates. But part of it is what's normative for the Confucians, let's say, is certain virtues, certain practices. And that they're pretty consistent on, like what you should do. They pretty much all will say the same thing to a question of what you should do. It's the theories behind it that's where they're really disagreeing amongst each other. So you could still say there's a kind of orthodox Confucianism, but the theories that are being used to justify it vary quite widely.
If we think about the case where we've got different versions of a text that we already had, how widely do these other versions diverge from what we had?
The strongest case we have is with the Laozi. So the Laozi, we found 2 copies of it in Ma Wangdui, so that's the early Han Dynasty one. There's also a slightly later Han Dynasty one that was bought by Peking University, so another looted text. So we have another Han Dynasty version of that. And then it was found in Guodian, but in Guodian, it's really very different because it only has about 1/3 of the passages from the whole Lao Tzu. And it was written on 3 bundles of bamboo strips. So it's not clear that it was one text or was it 3 collections of passages. And one of those collections has material that's not in the Lao Tzu. So it's not clear if those should be thought of as part of the collection or not. On top of that, the passages that are there, many of them are missing parts from the received version. So it seems like the received versions were formed by combining different things together in the passages. So with the Lao Tzu, there's lots of bigger questions about the status of the Lao Tzu. But if we just look generally at the transmission of texts from the Lao Tzu, from a few others that we have received versions of, and then there's a few that we found multiple excavated versions of. So they were unknown, but we found more than one version of them. If you look at those, they're pretty good in keeping the main meaning transmitted, but they were pretty open to changing the wording. Usually, I think in ways that they didn't see as significant, but they can be significant. It can change the meaning of the passage. And so we don't have any good sense of what like the original wording of any of these texts was, I think, because the wording's being changed over time as it's being rewritten. They were pretty liberal with adding stuff in as well. As often happens with transmitted text, it's something that clearly is trying to clarify the original passage, or make it, add some explanation, add a conclusion. But sometimes they just will put in other material that they saw as somehow related, but it's not clear how it relates. There are very few deliberate changes. There's a few. So the most famous is chapter 19 of the Lao Tzu. The received version, it's a criticism of virtues, and the received version has, among those virtues, sagacity, benevolence, and rightness. And those would have been key terms for the Confucians and for the Mohists. The Guodian version instead has more generic things like debate, striving, or being too active, and then deliberation. So somebody changed it to make it more polemical and more of an attack on kind of established schools. So there are some like deliberate changes like that, but for the most part, it seems like it's not really deliberate changes, except when they add in new material that then, when you're trying to read it as a whole, changes the meaning of it.
It's interesting to me that you're talking about adding material, because that seems to suggest that we have some grip, or not we, but you, because I certainly don't, but experts have some grip on what is more likely to be, as it were, the original version. But is that really a meaningful thought? So is there any plausible chance here of getting back to the real Lao Tzu, to which then other things have accreted, and you can say, oh, well, that word has changed here, but we know that the original word was such and such? Or is it more like you just have a kind of variety of different options and you can't get past that to some kind of or text that stands behind them all?
It probably doesn't even make sense to try to think of what the original text was, because I think they were always being modified. And so the ones where we have multiple excavated copies of them, they vary from each other, right? So already they're being changed from something that was earlier than them. And in a lot of cases, like with the Lao Tzu, it's probably pulling a kind of famous saying from one place and then somebody's adding some commentary around it. I don't think it really yet makes sense to try to say what was the original text or what's the authentic text, because the texts were always shifting. I do think we can still try to track a progression or development. And there are general principles for that, like additions are generally taken as later because it's more likely to add an explanation than to cut an explanation. But those are all just kind of probabilistic arguments. So there are a few cases where my own judgment would be that the Guodian version, which is the earliest version, is actually wrong, and that the later version is probably right, and that the Guodian, whoever copied that, made some kind of error in their copying. But there's debates about that.
Does the openness of the text itself tell us something about the intellectual life at the time and the way that these texts were being used? Because it strikes me that if you thought that these texts were, as it were, sacred, or maybe sacred is too strong a word, but authoritative, then you might be a lot more careful about not changing a single character. Whereas this sounds more like a fluid situation where they feel very free to change things, at least to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's right. It suggests that these were not seen as something like a sacred text. And you could say it shows something about their view of the status of the authors, that they felt pretty free to change the words that they used. With the Lao Tzu, it doesn't cite anyone. It doesn't say somebody said this. There's no appeals to authority at all. And it suggests, the way it's used suggests that they weren't actually concerned with who said it. They combine stuff around, add stuff in. And later uses of the Lao Tzu suggest something similar. Quotations will be taken out of context to make some other point. Like they seem like something that's a kind of living text that's being formed by the needs of the people using the text. With the Confucian text, it's a little trickier because they will, say Confucius said this, or whatever disciple it is, they will quote people. But even there, it seems like who they attribute it to will be different in different places, and like the wording still was changing. Partly, I think they themselves are aware that it's a kind of rhetorical move to attribute it to Confucius. I mean, they do have a kind of respect for Confucius, but they're not that concerned with exactly how he said things, it seems.
Right. They're more concerned maybe with the idea or the message or or maybe even what it says about his character. Right. So if you're thinking of it as a model sage, then you might not worry so much about the exact phrasing. You might worry more about what we're learning about Kongzi or Confucius by reading the text.
Now that you put it that way, it connects even to things that are fairly explicit in the text. In the Linyu has a famous example. So the Linyu is like the main collection of Confucius's sayings. It's translated as the Analects. Yeah. So there's a very famous passage where one disciple comes up to Confucius and says, when you hear something, should you put it into practice? Immediately put it into practice. And Confucius says, no, you should defer to your parents. And then another disciple comes up to him and asks word for word the same question. And he says, yes. And then a third disciple who heard both of these says, well, like, what's the answer here? And he says, well, the first guy is too reckless. And so I said, no, defer to your parents. The second guy is kind of lazy. And so I said, yes, to push him forward. So there's already a sense that these texts are meant for their practical effects rather than sort of what they're literally expressing.
Yeah, that passage, that's quite a famous passage from the Analects. It almost seems to push against the limits of communicating philosophy in written form, right? Because if it's written down, you can't control who's going to read it. Whereas if you're talking to someone, then you can adjust your message to the person you're talking to. So by kind of having this meta reflection on what you might say to different people, they've managed to get that idea into a written text that would be hard to get into that format.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That one of the things they're struggling with is how to think about writing and deal with writing in that context, because I think that's around when texts are writing and circulating. It's interesting. I mean, it's the exact problem that Plato's talking about in the Phaedrus. And I think you could say Plato's dealing with it by writing dialogues where there's always a context, whereas the Confucians are dealing with it by just throwing out a bunch of different things that somebody could use, some people might not use, and then saying explicitly, don't take any of these as absolute, right? These are all meant for a specific context.
Yeah. And if the reader had enough self-knowledge to know which piece of advice they should take, that would be good.
Right. I know that's the difficult thing.
Speaking of readers, we've been talking mostly about the people who set these texts down and what they were doing, what they were trying to achieve. But maybe the excavated texts also tell us something about the readers, because the existing texts, I guess, obviously would have been transmitted through a fairly elite chain of scholars, right? Because they would have wound up at libraries and so on, right? So there we're talking about officials, bureaucrats who are connected with the courts of rulers or other potentates. Is that also true of the excavated texts, or might we be dealing here with copies of texts that were being used by people who were a little bit further down on the food chain, so to speak?
It's hard to say because some of the texts are looted, so we don't know where they came from. But even the ones where we know where they came from, we're not really sure who the person was who was buried there, and we're not sure why the texts were buried with. So, hopefully we'll find something that will make this a little more clear. But if just look at the content, the majority of the texts talk about issues that only would concern someone in charge. So like when you should go to war or not, what you should do about punishing people or not, what kind of education you should promote. So they have that aspect. But on the other hand, there's things like how to deal with failing to get a job, and like how to cultivate yourself. So it seems clear that at least the majority, and I would probably project that to all of them, were meant for a kind of educated elite who wanted to influence government, but were not themselves in charge of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I would guess that at this time, the texts are largely circulating, are owned by those people. So they're not sort of imperial collections or like collections that the king has, although they probably had royal libraries as well, but that these different kind of thinkers would have their own collections of the texts that they liked. The most striking thing with it is that all of the collections that they found are extremely diverse in the philosophies that they have. So what we know that we didn't know for sure before is that the readers were not just reading like their school of philosophy, right? They were reading like quite widely across different schools and different perspectives. And really, it's striking that within like the Guardian text, there's hardly two texts that seem like they could have been written by the same person. Like almost every text is at least a slightly different view. And then some are Confucian, some are more Taoist. That does show us something significant. And there's been an argument that texts circulated kind of from master to disciple and were passed down in a lineage. And that seems to be false, or at least it's false by 300 BC. These are clearly like circulating across lots of different lines, and it was very much a kind of sharing of ideas going on.
Is there any pattern to the kinds of texts these philosophical texts are found with, or are these collections really just philosophical collections?
The Guodian texts, I would count all of them as philosophical texts. The speculation is that the person who they were buried with was a tutor to the royal family, so it was probably a teacher, but it's not certain. There's clues that suggest that. The Shanghai Museum collection also, almost all I would say are philosophical texts, but there's some more variety of texts there, but they're still all, we might say, intellectual discourse. So there's a commentary on the Book of Odes in it, but by Confucius. But then, like, say, Ma Wangdui has medical texts. So those are like really a distinct genre of text, although there still probably was overlap between, philosophy and medicine, medical literature.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that really seems to imply that they saw a commonality and a kind of genre, a unity of genre in what we're calling philosophical texts. It's kind of comforting, right? So it's not that we're projecting this back on the material, or even that the Han scholars are projecting this back on the material and saying, oh yeah, the legalists and the Moists and the Confucians, they were all sort of doing the same thing. Because if these collections already around 300 BCE already were kind of marking out a field of discourse in that way, then it sounds like we're entitled to think of that as a body of literature, which we can call philosophical literature.
Some people might question how appropriate to call it all philosophical, but I think it is a kind of coherent body of literature that is what I would call Chinese philosophy. So that will sometimes call it master's literature as a kind of later category. I think it is all of that kind of genre.
Okay. Maybe we can get a little bit more specific now and talk about just one specific work that you've worked on. Maybe we can take the example of the Mengzi and talk about how finding versions of the Mengzi in the excavated collections has changed your understanding of the text.
So Mengzi is the Chinese pronunciation that's been known in English as Mencius. And so I sometimes will use Mencius, sometimes we'll use Mengzi. It's better to use Mengzi, but I will sometimes switch back and forth.
Use the Chinese terms, but then we keep forgetting.
Right, yes. I do the same thing. With most of the main philosophical texts, with the Laozi as the one exception, we haven't found anything that we could take as being like, okay, this is another expression of Mengzi's philosophy. Right. So the texts help more indirectly. And so just to get into specifics with Mengzi in particular, I think the most helpful text is known in Chinese as the Xingzi Mingchu, which means something like the natural dispositions come from what is allotted. And the main thing that it does with the Mengzi is help us clarify the context that he's reacting against. So one example of this would be that in this Xingzi Mingchu text, Xing is this word for natural dispositions. It's kind of the key word for Mengzi and also for Xunzi later, and Taoists will use it as well. So it's saying that our natural dispositions are both good and bad. And it doesn't even actually label them that way. It's more, our natural dispositions are the kind of psychological given that we start with. And to cultivate ourselves, some of those dispositions should be encouraged and grown, and some of them need to be restrained. And then this leads into, in other texts that seem to have a similar viewpoint from the Guodian text, the idea that benevolence is internal because it's an extension of natural feelings that we have. And then say rightness, ritual propriety, these are external because these are constraints on the natural feelings that we have. So one really interesting thing is that the main debate in early Confucianism was Mengzi, who says our Xing, these dispositions are good, and Xunzi, who says these dispositions are bad. So what we find now is the original position kind of combined both of them. And one of the significant things overall, I know I said it was talk about Mengzi, but is that Xunzi is usually seen as like kind of a heterodox Confucian in arguing that our dispositions are bad. But it's clear now that he's as authentic to this original as Mengzi is. They're really both taking up one side of this position that was originally unified together. So we now know that what Monks is arguing against, which is this idea that we have both of these tendencies, and we can see, I think, more precisely what's new in his account. So one thing that's new in his account is an argument that even virtues that are focused on rule following, right? So rules that clearly are socially taught, like ritual, even those are motivated by natural feelings that we have. So he uses shame as the example, right? So shame is what drives us to follow the rules. So the rules have to be learned, and in that sense, they're external. But the virtue of rightness of following the rules is motivated internally. So essentially, he's taking this position from the Xingzi Mingchu and saying, no, all of the virtues arise from encouraging natural feelings, even the ones that seem really external. It just gives us a more precise sense of what exactly he's arguing, like what's new in his account.
It's interesting to me that he would be reacting to, actually both him and Xunzi would be sort of taking one half of this original position, because the original position on the face of it looks a lot more plausible, right? Like if you just hang around with children, for example, it seems like they have some good instincts and some bad instincts, and you should be trying to cultivate or help them cultivate the good instincts and try to rein in the bad instincts, right? So when they hit another kid, you say, don't do that. When they are generous and give something to another kid, you say, good girl, good boy, whatever, right? So why would they have been motivated to take just one half of the story, if you see what I mean?
So I think with Mengzi, he is still, in a way, distinguishing two kinds of motivation, but he wants to say that the negative motivations he associates with desires for sensory pleasure, which he rhetorically at least tries to separate from these natural dispositions. So in a way, he's still keeping the two sides. But I think the significant thing he's trying to say is that in trying to cultivate virtue and trying to get other people to cultivate virtue, we should be appealing always to their natural motivations. So in fact, like the rules you follow are going to restrict your pursuit of sensory pleasures. He even will say, that you might have to die to follow the rules, right? But the motivation is not just external. The motivation also is internal, which is this sense of shame. One of the, I think, most profound things he says is that he makes an argument that everyone has certain things they would refuse to do, even facing death. And this is not because they've been taught it, but it's because internally there are certain things we care about even more than our own life, with the obvious example being like our children. But also he thinks even, there are certain things we wouldn't do to a stranger. And maybe he's being a little optimistic there, right? But his overall motivation is really not so much to say we don't have any negative tendencies, but rather to say that all of virtue, all of the social order should be based on appeals to our natural feelings rather than on just, you can't do this, or else you're going to be, hurt, you're going to be punished.
Okay, that does seem very powerful, because I can imagine he's thinking, well, if the thing that we want people to do isn't rooted in their nature at all, then how could we ever expect them to do it, right? Because there's nothing in them to get a kind of hook on to push them in the right direction, or maybe pull their nature in the right direction, a direction it already wants to go.
He's a little, again, maybe overly optimistic, but his ideal is to have a social order that doesn't use much physical coercion, right? So people do the right thing because they would feel shame if they didn't do it, rather than because they're afraid of being punished for not doing it. So there's a strong political dimension to the whole thing.
By the way, just to go back to the situation of the actual text, so the material you're drawing on, are you saying that this more kind of diverse picture where there's both good and bad in nature, are you saying that that's in an alternative version of the Mengzi itself, or in some other Confucian text to which the Mengzi
No, so it's a different Confucian text. So we don't have alternate versions of the Mengzi at all. Okay. And so what we have are these ones that there are links to the Mengzi. So within the Mengzi, there's a debate with a guy named Gaozi. These are very famous passages. It's a debate about whether virtues are internal or external. And historically, there's always been a question, who is Gaozi? And some people have even said he's probably a Moist, or maybe quasi-Taoist, maybe. But now, from the things he says, it's pretty clear that he's expressing some of these views that appear in the excavated texts. So we can say, okay, well, this is the position that the monk is really arguing against there. and then can see, from, also from the language he uses, there's significant overlap with the Xingzi Mingzhu text in terms of his conception of the dispositions, various things like that. I think pretty conclusively say, like, this is the context against which he's arguing.
It's really nice how this sort of reflects the task of dealing with the texts themselves. We said that they're putting it together is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And now at this higher level, it's like putting together the history of Confucianism itself is like you found a missing piece, right? So, this is what so it was actually responding to, right?
Yeah, it's really, really fun. You said earlier, like, why spend all the trouble trying to read these texts? But it's partly just, if we found a whole bunch of texts that were written, I don't know, between the time of Plato and Aristotle that no one had ever read before, it's exciting, to see what these are and then to try to retell the story and rethink the story.
Yeah. So your enthusiasm for these texts maybe already sort of answers the question I'm about to ask you in conclusion, but I'm going to ask anyway. You're unusual in that you work seriously on both European and Chinese philosophy. So, for example, you worked on Leibniz. And in fact, early on in your career, you sort of started out as an early modernist and moved more and more into the Chinese literature. Do you think of these as roughly comparable tasks? So trying to, read the excavated Chinese texts and trying to read Leibniz. I mean, obviously Leibniz presents his own challenges, right? But do you feel like as a historian of philosophy, you're kind of doing the same thing? Or do you feel that it's very different experience and challenge working in, say, early modern European philosophy and ancient Chinese philosophy? Sorry, that's kind of a big question, but since your work straddles that divide, I'm wondering whether you sort of feel like it's almost like you're two different kinds of historian of philosophy, depending on what day it is and which text you're working on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I fundamentally think it's the same methodology. And so I would feel comfortable just saying I do the history of philosophy, and I partly do early modern and partly do early Chinese philosophy. And really, I think doing the history of philosophy is always what people would call comparative philosophy, right? Because you're always bridging between this earlier viewpoint and contemporary viewpoint. So I think it is largely the same. And I would say you find in both the same kind of two poles among scholars. So people who are more interested in kind of trying to pull out philosophical positions they can use now, and people who are more historical and kind of more interested in getting a foreign perspective. And so I'm always more on that second side. So even with Leibniz, we're trying to read marginalia in his books in the Leibniz archive, so I've kind of engaged more on that historical side. So I do think it's pretty similar, but maybe the biggest difference is in terms of what we might call the reception history. So reading the history of Western philosophy, you kind of already come to it knowing roughly what it means now, because there's been this continual progression of interpreting it. With Chinese philosophy, it's harder to know how to bridge it to modernity, but then especially to say, Western Anglophone discourses of philosophy. How do you build that bridge? There's work that's been done on that, of course, but it's still much more in question how you would do that. And I would say for that reason, there's much deeper disagreements about how you would do that, like more fundamental, different interpretations of how early Chinese texts. And then there's lots of topics that people haven't really talked about very much. So I was asked to write an essay for an encyclopedia of philosophy of religion on philosophy of religion in early China. I'm not sure anybody's talked about it. Like I came in like totally kind of from scratch to think, well, how would I even approach this? Because they don't distinguish philosophy of religion in the same way. I mean, it's so different, but how do you bring that into this discourse? Whereas anybody in Western philosophy, you'd at least have some orientation on how you're going to bring them into a discussion of philosophy of religion. Mm-hmm. So there's more uncertainty in the interpretations and more space for creativity. I have to say part of why I shifted from Leibniz to Chinese philosophy was just that it's really hard to say anything important new on Leibniz. You can, but it's hard. A lot has been discussed. With Chinese philosophy, it's pretty easy. Like there's lots of topics that no one has talked about in a contemporary setting. Of course, through the history of Chinese philosophy, you have lots of interpretations of the Mencius. But when you're trying to think, well, how does it apply, to the world now? There's a lot more space for how to figure that out.
Okay. Well, that's a bit of motivation for anyone who's out there listening, wondering whether they should get into the field of Chinese philosophy. And one of the purposes of this series is to encourage people to think that that might be a good idea. So I think you've helped a little bit with that. Thanks so much. And thanks very much for joining us. Next time, we are going to start looking at our first so-called school, although as we've been talking about a lot, this whole idea of dividing things into schools that are defined in terms of like standard doctrines is a little bit problematic. And the first school we're tackling is indeed Confucianism, which is what we've just been talking about. So that's what the next several episodes will be about. But for now, I will thank Frank Perkins very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me. It was a fun conversation.
Yeah, likewise, I enjoyed it. And I will invite the listeners to join me and Karen next time as we start to look at Confucianism here on the history of philosophy in China.